Thanks for taking the time to download this BBC Radio 5 Live podcast. To search for other podcasts you might like, click bbc.co.uk/5live, where you'll also find our terms of use.
This month marks 20 years since the death of Bobby Moore, the only person to lift football's World Cup for England. Over the next hour, we'll discuss his legacy as a footballer and as a man.
And here come England. Bobby Moore putting his arms around Alf Ramsey. Alf Ramsey shaking hands with all of the England players as they move onto the red carpet to come up the steps in front of the royal box to receive the World Cup.
He didn't talk about football at all in those first few years. He was a very private man. He always kept his own counsel.
Every player indeed. Harold Shepperson, the trainer, Alf Ramsey, the manager. And here's Bobby Moore arriving in front of the royal box to receive the cup. And it's Her Majesty the Queen shaking hands at this moment with Bobby Moore.
In recent years, people have been honoured for that and they've been knighted. It's unfortunate that Bob died young and wasn't knighted before his death.
He collects the cup. Next to him is Sir Stanley Rouse, and then the Duke of Edinburgh.
I understand what he was going through. Bowel cancer is not only debilitating, it's also embarrassing.
Bobby Moore shaking hands with all the officials there in the front row. Holds the cup high. Hear the cheers in the background.
We've done at Cancer Research UK some market research about Bobby and how young people, whether they know who he is and what he achieved. And we were amazed at the results. People do know what he did.
Every one of the England players. Bobby Moore just kissing the cup.
Well, coming up, we'll hear from Bobby Moore's widow, Stephanie, his former England teammate, George Cohen. We'll speak live to Harry Redknapp as well. And with me in the studio, two men who are very good friends of Bobby's, his biographer and best man at his wedding, Jeff Powell, and the BBC's Jonathan Pearce, who commentated with him for many years on London's Capital Radio. We'd love to hear your memories as well. Sports Day on the BBC Sport website's been debating all day about whether Bobby Moore was England's greatest ever player. Tell us what you think. You're in the mood to text tonight, 85058, or you can tweet us at BBC 5 Live. Gentlemen, good evening. Jeff, very good to have you with us. You've written very movingly today in your piece in the Daily Mail about Bobby and your disbelief that it's 20 years since he left us.
Well, it does seem amazing, doesn't it? I think that's partly conditioned by the fact that still it's 1966 is the only major tournament we've won. It's our solitary triumph. And I think that's kept Bobby abreast with time, because had a subsequent England team won a World Cup, it would have taken its place in history. But it's still very much the present, and Bobby is still the great iconic figure. Perhaps in a way, if there's any consolation in dying young, as Princess Diana did, the last images of you of a handsome guy, a beautiful woman, and he lingers in the national consciousness as this sort of wonderful ambassadorial, iconic and very good-looking figure that we who are left don't grow as old as they did.
Jonathan, has he become more important to English football in the last 2 decades in any way?
Bobby?
Yeah.
I think that he stands... He's become more important in a way because he stands for a better era. He stands for a better generation of footballers. He's held up now, and people say, if only players would behave off the field of play as Bobby and his generation did. It paints him in a whiter than white colour, to be honest, because Bobby had his naughty moments too. He'd have said to you he was no angel, but he was in a different way. I think as well, like Jeff says, there are the iconic pictures. We still look at the picture of him embracing Pelé in 1970. There are still those great moments, and the greatest of them all was when he wiped his hands so that he didn't get Her Majesty's hands covered, as he would say, he used to drop his H's all the time, dirty, and put out his hands and took the cup off her in 1966. So we have those iconic moments. And, as a commentator, you still feel when you see a fantastic steel tackle, not when Bobby never used to go to ground. You think of the Jairzinho tackle, you think of the 1974 Cup final. And when you see a great tackle, I almost say, gosh, that's Bobby Moore-esque. No one could play. No, we've not seen a defender like him. But yes, there is a legacy there.
You wrote, Jeff, the inscription on the plinth beneath his statue at Wembley, didn't you?
Yes.
I mean, I'll happily read it out, but you probably know it off by heart, don't you?
I forget some of it. You go.
Immaculate footballer, imperial defender, immortal hero of 1966, First Englishman to raise the World Cup aloft. Come in any time you want. Favourite son of London's East End. Finest legend of West Ham United. National treasure. Master of Wembley. Lord of the game. Captain extraordinary. Gentleman of all time.
I've always been the master of understatement. But it wasn't a time for saying anything other than the full-blooded truth about him. I mean, this was an exceptional man, the best defender of all time. And he conducted himself, as Jonathan's touched on, in a manner which befitted his position as captain of England, and he was very conscious of the responsibilities of that. And he was a role model in the true sense of the word. He represented other things as well. He was the footballer who brought the muddied oafs of the pitch, as they were perceived by the great and good for a long time, through to becoming society darlings in a way, not in quite the way that Beckham's promoted himself, but in a strong and steadfast and upright manner. So he broke a glass ceiling there, which of course a lot of footballers have come through afterwards. In that sense, he served the game because he opened up a fresh world of commercial opportunity, which it was too late for him to exploit, but which others have gone on to do. And he also represented in our society at a time when it was becoming beset towards the end of his life by thuggishness and brutishness. He represented a decency and a virtue which I think people clung on to. And that spirit has survived, partly because, of course, 66 is still very much in the national consciousness, and it's demonstrated by the fact that still thousands of pounds pour into his fund for cancer. There's still this national identity with him, which is remarkable, considering he's been dead 20 years.
We'll talk more about the Bobby Moore Fund because, Jonathan, you've been speaking to Stephanie Moore about that very subject. Here are two views of Bobby Moore now. In a moment, you'll hear from George Cohen on Moore the captain. But first, here's Stephanie on the man himself, who she met in 1979.
He didn't talk about football at all, ever, in those first few years. And I did begin to wonder what he actually did for a living at that time. It was only later that I learnt that he was still involved in football on the periphery. In fact, I used to joke with him and say, what are you doing? Are you a taxi driver? I mean, what are you doing? You always seem to be driving places. Yeah, he was an extremely modest man, never spoke about himself, always asked about others and asked open questions about others. He was a very private man. He always kept his own counsel.
I met him, I think, at Lilleshall or the Bank of England ground in Roehampton. He would make sure that he met every player. One of the things that Elf did, I think, was wonderful when he took over the England side was get rid of cliques, which we were suffering from for many, many years. And I think that Bob helped out on that brilliantly. He understood that these players had considerable knowledge amongst them. He wasn't going around shouting at anybody. He advised, talked very calmly, very carefully. And I think everybody appreciated that.
Jonathan, what about your assessment of Bobby Moore's character as a person?
He's the most decent man I've ever met in football. He was immaculate as a man, immaculately dressed, immaculately prepared. He was generous to a fault, generous with his time. He would talk to princes and paupers in exactly the same way. Wherever we used to go, he used to get people coming up to him and wanting to know about 66, wanting to know about 70 and 1970 and all that. And he would give his time to them. He wouldn't stint. Towards the end, when he was poorly, we'd be on a train and they'd come up and he'd say, "Man of my age, old son, needs his sleep." Shut his eyes, and then they think he was asleep, and they go away, and then he'd open his eyes and carry on chatting to me. But he was very humble. As Stephanie was saying, he never used to go on about himself. He'd talk about Jackie Charlton's role in 1966. He'd talk about Nobby Stiles' importance in 1966. He'd talk about the squad players. He never used to forget those. And one of his closest friends at West Ham, may not have been a star at West Ham, but was Harry Redknapp. And when Harry was involved in a car crash in 1990, Bobby left our commentary camp and went to see Harry in hospital. And that was typical of the man as well. I just think he was peerless. He was a one-off, absolutely unique. He was one of the best people I've ever met in my life.
We're going to speak to Harry Redknapp a little bit later in the programme. Following England's World Cup win, Bobby Moore received an OBE, but he was never honoured with a knighthood, and the current England manager, Roy Hodgson, feels that's a source of regret.
He's captained England to a World Cup victory, and that should never be forgotten. I mean, luckily, in recent years, people have been honoured for that, and they've been knighted for their services, and it's unfortunate that Bob died young and wasn't knighted before his death, because there's no doubt he was a major figure in England winning the World Cup.
Jonathan, to what extent do you feel that English football failed to recognise him and make use of his time once he'd retired from the game?
Disgracefully. You know, he had a brief period as manager at Southend and was on the board at Southend, Oxford City, where he gave Harry his first chance as a coach. He should have been a Beckenbauer-type figure. He should have been, a figurehead, maybe not as an administrator as Platini is, or somebody. He should have had a role, and they didn't even consider him, you know. He wrote to Watford when Graham Taylor got the job at Watford. He tried to get in there, and do you know, Mark, he contacted the FA once about the possibility of becoming England manager, and he didn't even get a reply, as Stephanie told me the other day.
His motto in life was always make the day full and positive. So he never dwelt on the negative, ever. But I have heard that from other quarters, that the FA didn't even respond. I know he also felt quite badly about the way he was treated at the end by West Ham, not allowing him to go until it was on a free transfer, and in fact never went back to West Ham again. But he didn't dwell on that. He did talk to me about West Ham, actually, but he didn't dwell on the fact that he'd not been recognised by the FA in the way that perhaps he could have been.
And at Wembley, for many years, was only that one little plaque underneath the subway bridge. And I remember when they put it up and they phoned me up and said, "This is what we're doing." And I was disgusted. I thought it was horrendous that was all they had for our World Cup winning captain. Now it's different. There's a statue outside. But for years, you must have been appalled, really, with the way his name was not held in reverence, like, for example, Franz Beckenbauer is in Germany. Sir Bobby Charlton is still in this country. Other countries seem to have found a role for their leading men. We didn't with Bob.
I've never been appalled or angry, the same as I wasn't appalled or angry that Bobby should die of cancer. Life is not fair. But what I have thought over the years is I'm just very sad for Bobby that he wasn't recognised, and the recognition that's come latterly he will never know about. And he would be very bemused to see that wonderful sculpture by Philip Jackson outside Wembley and the Bobby Moore Club that sits right behind it. We've been in partnership with the FA now for quite a few years, and the FA have been very supportive of the Bobby Moore Fund for Cancer Research UK and Bobby's legacy. I think that would warm Bobby's heart to know that had happened.
I think he was warmed as well when he used to go out to grounds working with me on the radio, and because of the people that used to come up to him, not just supporters but managers and current players in the day. I remember in 1992 in Sweden, Gary Lineker got substituted rather controversially, and the next day Bobby did the interview with Gary. Gary wasn't speaking to anyone, but he was like little boy on Christmas Day, because it was Bobby doing the interview, and he loved that involvement again in the game, didn't he?
Yes, he did, and he loved working all those years he worked with you for, can I mention it, the radio station Capital Gold. He loved that. He loved turning up at the ground. It didn't matter the ground or how far away it was. I remember you driving off in hailstorms and goodness knows what, and pitching up at grounds that were empty and setting up all the radio equipment, and Bobby loved that involvement, being back where football is played, no matter the ground. The bigger the ground, the better, obviously. But he loved football at every level and everybody that was involved in it.
Was he ever bitter towards players of the modern generation with you, players who earned a lot more money than Bobby ever did playing the game?
I did ask Bobby about that once, about the money thing, because I don't think that English football recognised Bobby as perhaps they could have done. Bobby was never bitter about that. He never referred to it, never talked about it. But on the occasion when I asked him, he said, "Stephanie, you must understand that relatively speaking, in my day, football gave me a very, very good standard of living. It might not be comparable to now, but it gave me a very good standard of living." And also, of course, he achieved things in the world of football that most people would only ever aspire to.
Jeff, talk to us about Bobby Moore, the manager then, a spell managing Southend in the 1980s. Was he too nice? Was he not ruthless enough to be a good manager?
No, I don't think that's true at all. he was completely misunderstood by people in high places, which was unfortunate. Bobby would be calm and composed. If he needed to do something that was not that pleasant, he would appear aloof from it, even though he would have compassion for someone who might be being disappointed by any decision he made. He was absolutely firm and resolute, as he was on the pitch in all matters. The thought that he couldn't coach is ridiculous. He was the youngest player ever to qualify with a full FA coaching badge. When he went to Crystal Palace for a while and they put him with the youngsters, Malcolm and Terry Venables, they achieved remarkable things with that. His humility was a factor which people didn't appreciate. It was a strength. I mean, I recall standing in a bar near West Ham's ground one day, I was in a pub after a game, and a guy came up and said, "Oh, but Mr. Moore, you don't seem to realise how wonderful you are and how wonderful it was you won the World Cup and you're the greatest defender," and went into this great spiel about him. And he leaned across and he said, he said, "If you're quite good at something, you don't have to tell everybody." And
so were you saying he didn't sell himself well enough to be a manager? I don't think he should have had
to. We must correct a couple of impressions because the FA were guilty of ignoring him with regard to the knighthood. Although he didn't declare that he was terminally ill, everybody knew that he was very ill, and there was a possibility it could be a problem. And there was a leftover resentment about Alf Ramsey, about Bobby Moore, about all the footballers, because the people at the FA at the time thought they were the people who really mattered and were important. It's important to remember that Alf Ramsey was the first England manager who had the right of selection over the selection committee. This was the mentality which prevailed, and that prevented Bobby Moore being knighted before he died. Subsequently, if I can just change your story on Watford slightly, the story on Watford was that Elton John and I became a little bit friendly at the time when he became attached to the England team when Don Revie was manager. And 7 o'clock one morning, I'm lying in bed and Elton rang and said, "Do you think Bobby will come and manage Watford?" And that was how the contact was made. So I got hold of Bobby and I fixed a lunch, and we went to lunch at what was then the Howard Hotel on the Embankment in London. And they discussed the whole thing. I left the table while they sorted out the financial terms. The deal was done over that table, and Bobby was on his way to become manager of Watford. Then suddenly it went quiet. There was an embarrassing silence. Bobby didn't hear any more. And as it drifted and Graham Taylor became obviously the candidate, and no one's saying that didn't work out for Watford, it worked out very well for them, despite the style of football. The whole situation became clear that influential voices in football who were able to get to Elton's ear dissuaded him from making the appointment. And that is as disgraceful as many of the things that Jonathan described. Who else should have been defensive coach for England? Who else should have been given, as Jonathan says, the Beckenbauer path, a little bit of club management, and then come in and work with the national side, possibly end up manager? Could have been like Franz, the captain, the player, and the coach to have won the World Cup. This was a great talent thrown away. As Dennis Law said, on behalf of Scotland, who hated Bobby Moore but loved him at the same time, the bloody trouble with Bobby Moore is he's got a computer in his head and you can't find a way through him. And this was the intelligence that this country's football wasted.
Jonathan, I'll come to you in a second about your memories of working with him for Capital Gold in those days. But Harry Redknapp is on the line, who knew Bobby very well, of course, from his time at West Ham. Harry, good evening. We appreciate your time. Interesting what Jeff is saying there, that he should have been the Franz Beckenbauer of this country. I'm sure you'd go along with that.
Absolutely. England wasted him. West Ham could have had the greatest ambassador any club could have ever had. Beckenbauer, as Jeff said, Bayern Munich, Bobby Charlton at Man United. What disappointed me when Bobby died, they wanted to build, name a stand after him, build statues. And when he was alive, no one really, I've got to be honest, showed an awful lot of interest in him. I just found it absolutely amazing.
Why was that, Harry? Have you got any idea at all?
No idea at all. There's never been a nicer man or classier man on the field, off the field, the greatest ambassador this country could have ever had, the greatest captain we've ever seen, and was absolutely wasted. Ends up, I saw him get thrown out the stand at West Ham, and I swear went to a game. I think West Ham were in the Championship at the time. I went and sat in the end block, And I went and sat next to Frank Lampard's mum. Frank Senior was playing. I think I'd come back from America. Bobby, suddenly I hear somebody behind me. The stand was half empty, that end block. There was no one hardly in there. I hear someone, Harry, I look round, there's Bobby. He said, I see you, cup of tea half time. Yeah, lovely, Bob. Bobby used to come in the little side door at Upton Park, 10 minutes after kick-off. He'd come in, the gateman, obviously, but everybody idolised him. He'd walk in up the stairs, sit at the back of the stand. He had the little shop still probably over the road, the sports shop. And the steward came up to him, nice guy, not his fault. He said, I'm sorry, Bobby. He said, I've been told that by the secretary you're not allowed him without a ticket. And half time I looked round, Bobby left. I don't think he ever went back again. Absolutely unbelievable.
Wow, that is impossible, Harry, to get your head round.
Yeah, I was there. I saw it.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget it as long as I live.
You were his assistant manager at Oxford City. And I'm saying City so people don't mishear me, in the Isthmian League.
Yeah.
Did you think, what's going on here?
Well, yeah. I mean, Bobby, what happened? Bobby came out to Seattle and we played together out there, and Jeff was there, Jeff Pearce. And I spent every day with Bob, with the kids and the families, and, it was great. We had a great time. And Bob said, look, if ever I get a job, Harry, I want you to work with me, And I was out in America. I'd gone to Phoenix, and Bobby rings up himself, took over at Oxford. I've got to be honest, I thought it was Oxford United, but it was Oxford City in the Isthmian League. Anyway, I came home. If Moro rung up, you'd be there. Yeah. So I came home to work with Bob. I used to sit there some nights, Tuesday night, Averley away or wherever we were playing, middle of winter, raining, sitting in a little dugout. And I think, what am I doing here? And, I think, what am I doing? I look next to me, and there was Bob, and I think, what is he doing here? I mean, it was incredible, really, that he wasn't given the opportunity to manage at the top level and to become a great ambassador, for English football.
And Jeff was saying there, so I'll get your view, Harry, that you cannot judge him by the spell he had at Southend as a manager.
Not a chance. No way. I was with him. The man had a football brain as good as anybody you ever met in your life. I mean, it's all circumstances, this game. People get carried away with us managers. You walk into the right club, you go and take over a club with fantastic resources, whether it's Chelsea, because of Abramovich or somebody, you've got a chance. You go and take a club over where there's no resources. No one's got a magic wand. He had no chance at Southend. It was impossible.
Harry, what was going on at football at the time? Bobby Moore's thrown out of West Ham. He doesn't get a chance. What was going on?
I don't know. I don't know why. I really, to this day, I can't. And I said to somebody today, can you tell me how he hasn't got a knighthood? Can you tell me how Bobby Moore wasn't Sir Bobby Moore? When, no disrespect, there's a lot of footballers who couldn't lace his boots or have done as much in the game as he has done, who get all kinds of, accolades and bestowed on them. I just find it absolutely amazing.
But the one thing, Harry, which is good, is that kids today know who Bobby Moore is. Everybody knows who Bobby... I mean, clearly my generation do, but, kids today, my son knows who Bobby Moore is. He's 14. And that's great. The name lives on.
Of course. Yeah, he was special. There was no one like Bobby. No one like Bobby. He was... I never heard him have a bad word for anybody. He was a fantastic ambassador. He was... The kids would all come, he'd sign every autograph, he'd get them all in a straight line. He was immaculate in the way he presented himself. And he was the same on the field. He didn't kick anybody. He didn't go around booting people up in the air. He played the game, he read the game, he passed the ball. He was just fantastic.
Harry, we really appreciate your time tonight.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Nice
Lovely to hear your stories.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
On digital and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
bbc.co.uk/5 Live.
It's 20 years ago this month since Moore's death, and coming up we'll talk about his legacy as a footballer and a defender, and hear how his name has gone on to save lives through his cancer charity. With me in the studio, the journalist Jeff Powell, who was Bobby Moore's close friend and biographer, and the BBC's Jonathan Pearce, who shared many commentary boxes with him up and down the country. 85058 on the text. Andy from Swindon, a disgrace the way he was under-acknowledged by certain sections of football. Lovely man, a proper role model. And Ethan says, we named our lovely daughter Chelsea. Many people who knew us looked very puzzled when they heard this and say, why would West Ham fans of over 40 years give their daughter his name? She's named after the greatest footballer this country ever produced, I proudly say. Full name, Jeff?
Robert Frederick Chelsea Moore. Chelsea not for the football club, but after his grandfather, who took that name for reasons other than football completely.
For reasons other than football. 85058 on the text. Jonathan, up and down the country, to all grounds of all sizes, it must have been one heck of a ride.
It was. I mean, it was like Christmas Day every day for me. I was there, in the front seat of the car. He insisted on driving everywhere. He wouldn't let me drive, and he'd tell stories. Yeah. And he told me the story of when they were away with England and they went out for one or two nights, and Sir Alf came into a pub, and they're all drinking pints, and he's looked at them and said, why don't you follow the example of your captain? Look at him, wonderful man. He's just drinking half pints. What he didn't know is the shelf underneath the table. He had another 43 half pints lined up. And then Harold Shepherdson one night came in. They'd been out, and Sir Alf put their passports on their bed and said, "That's it. You're finished." And how frightened he was. Bobby said he was terrified. He thought that was it. He thought he was going to miss out on 66 because he'd run his contract down at West Ham. And had it not been for Sir Alf getting Ron Greenwood and Bobby together, he would have missed out on the World Cup. He was so generous, and so funny. And wherever you went, managers sat up and took notice that Bobby was in the ground, Bobby was in the room. I have to mention here, Mick Lowes, BBC Radio Newcastle, who is the best radio commentator I've ever worked with. He was the guy that got Bobby into radio, so we owe him a huge debt. And Lowesy tells this great story. In Italy, 1990, Bobby and he did Romania-Ireland. Now, Romania have just been beaten in the worst possible way. They've gone out on penalties. And Bobby and Mick went to a restaurant later on that night. Hour and a half later, in come the Romanian players, Georgie Hadji, all those players. They'd just been knocked out of the World Cup. They took 3 steps into the restaurant, turned around, all walked out. Bobby and Mick thinking, what's happening here? 10 minutes later, they all came back. George Hadji was the first man up with an autograph book to get Bobby Moore's
They've gone back to get their autograph books.
People were spellbound when he went into a room. He said to me in 1990, so many stories I could tell, Mark. He's on the eve of the final. He said, "Come with me to the World Cup winners' banquet. They always have one," and it was in the Cavalieri Hilton in Rome. And I said, "Bob, I can't do that. I've never even played the game. Didn't have any pace. Couldn't head the ball. Couldn't run." He said, "Neither could I, old son. Look what I did." But anyway, so we went to this thing, and he said, "Bring your little tape machine," he used to call it, "and we'll see who we can get to interview." And I said, "Well, if the great man comes in, blimey." So anyway, we were there, and I went to the bar with Giorgi Canaglia, the old Italy player, who he felt as embarrassed as I did. And sure enough, in comes Pele, and it was parting of the Red Sea, and they did the 1970 iconic embrace again, and flashbulbs popped up, and all this sort of stuff. And he's beckoned me over, and I went over, and he said, "Pele, would you do an interview for my friend from England?" "Yes." And there is a tape of this somewhere, and the interview goes like this, and I stood there. "Hello, Mr. Pele." "Hello. Have you been in Italy long?" 2 weeks. "Has the weather been good?" "Yes." "Thank you, Mr. Pele." And as I walked away, Bob's gone, "Never do that to me again, old son, will you?" But he was brilliant. In 1992, we were in Sweden, and one of our reporters was recalled because England had gone out, and because of financial reasons. The lad's name was Julian Waters. He's now at Sky. Bobby paid for Julian to stay on, paid everything, paid out of his own pocket and that's what he was like. We were lucky enough to win the Sony Award one year, and Bobby took us all out. He paid for everyone. He was so generous. And he talked to the reporters coming in for the first time. And when we were at grounds, if there was a 17-year-old, what they call them YTS boys in our academy boy, he'd make sure he spoke to him. He was like that all the way.
Well, they must have had $1 billion when the fact that Bobby Moore was speaking to them. Let's hear a little bit more about his style of defending. We heard there some highlights from that great performance against Brazil in 1970. Here's the view of Roy Hodgson and George Cohen, who played alongside him, of course, in the back four in 1966.
You have to learn how to defend from very, very early age, and he was in the right place with West Ham United. They were bringing through a lot of youngsters, and they taught them from a very age how to defend. First of all, he didn't have speed, so he had to have positional play. Marked space very well. And when he distributed the ball, and he would look around and get his head up, and he would play the ball sympathetically. Now, I've seen people pass the ball 10 yards as if it was delivered it like a rocket. He would deliver the ball at the right time, right place, at the right pace. And this is his training. He was very, very good. And he remembered it. And great players remember what they're taught.
His reading of the game, his understanding of the game, his positional sense was also second to none, and of course that made him a perfect partner with Jackie Charlton in the centre of the English defence. And I would say still to this day, many football managers who had seen those two play would be more than happy if they could reconstruct a Bobby Moore-Jackie Charlton partnership, because the two knitted so well together, and largely because Bobby's reading of the game was so good.
So, Jeff, we hear so much today about how modern defenders must learn to stay on their feet because of the current laws. Bobby Moore would have loved it in today's world, wouldn't he?
Well, he'd weep at the defending today. The defending in the Premiership is chronic. Yes, stay on your feet. I mean, we discussed a few iconic tackles before. There's a hat-trick of pictures of him tackling George Best. I don't know if you remember that, Jonathan, where he just comes through him. He goes almost down on one knee, but rises the other side. And as he goes away, George Best turns and goes, hands up in the air, going, what am I supposed to do about that? And we're talking about probably the greatest British footballer of all time. Pelé said he was the greatest defender he ever played against. Beckenbauer said he was the greatest defender, and that's quite something, given how good Beckenbauer was. What Bobby had, and I think it's important to say, is he was the best defender. Franz did a bit more going forward in some aspects, although Bobby's passing was inch perfect, of course, but he came out more than Bobby did. But Bobby's positional sense, the sort of the radar was unbelievable. His understanding of the game was extraordinary. And it was that knowledge which was thrown away. He was also a commanding and heavy taskmaster by leadership and by his reaction. If people did something wrong, he didn't scream at them, but they used to say, the England team, a look from Bobby as to when they've made a mistake was quite the most devastating thing that ever happened to them. And Big Jack Charlton tells the story that the only time Bobby ever swore at him, because he didn't like to lapse into the vernacular, he liked to always be in control and master of not only the football but his emotions, was the time when Germany equalised to force extra time in the final at Wembley, and he turned and swore at him and said, "You never so-and-so do that again." And Jack said, I thought I'd been pinned to the crossbar, and if we'd lost the final, I wouldn't have been able to talk to him.
Was his reading of the game in his head, because people always say, don't they, didn't really have any pace, but his reading of the game was what made him positionally so astute and therefore such a good player.
Yes, I mean, Ron Greenwood said that he was surprised that Bobby Moore was able to play past 25 because he thought he'd have a hole in his chest from keep going to the near post and cutting out crosses and then walking away with the ball. His positional play was amazing, of course, and that created his passing out as well, as Jonathan referred to and as Harry referred to, that he would caress the ball to a teammate. And perhaps the greatest example was the final goal in the World Cup final. And Jack Charlton says, like everyone else, George Cohen, they were screaming at Bobby to clear the ball as it dropped into the penalty area. Not Bobby. He pulled it down, jinked past one guy, and set Geoff Hurst away with the perfect pass for the goal, which Kenneth Wolstenholme said, they think it's all over. It is now. That was a product not only of a wonderful skill with his right foot, but of the positional play. Bobby was always completely aware of what was going on around him on the pitch. He read the game for Alf Ramsey on the pitch. He changed things on the pitch, which never happens now, ahead of half-time for the manager or during the game when things got difficult. He would tell the fullbacks to tuck in. He'd call one midfield player to come back and defend. He'd order Bawley to cover an overlapping fullback. He might even change positions for them. That doesn't happen anymore. This was, I think I mentioned before, a computer on legs, an astonishing football intelligence.
That's very interesting, Jeff. Bobby died of cancer in February 1993. In the years since, many millions of pounds have been raised through the Bobby Moore Fund. George Cohen also suffered from bowel cancer.
I recall a visit to the Tate Gallery where Bobby Charlton was having a painting hung of him, and my wife said to him, she looked at Bobby and looked into his eyes and said, had the same sort of deep, misty look that you had, and I managed to get over it after 6 years, but unfortunately Bobby didn't. I understand what he was going through. Bowel cancer is not only debilitating, it's also embarrassing. And that professional footballers are easily embarrassed by this sort of thing, and he wouldn't be no different.
Jonathan, you've been speaking to Stephanie Moore about her work for the Bobby Moore Fund since his death.
Yes, it's raised nearly £20 million. It's been phenomenal. It's really been a huge boost to imperial cancer research. The way that people responded immediately after his death, it's carried on going. They have lots of events. There's another impetus now tomorrow, Make Bobby Proud. They're launching a new thing at Wembley tomorrow with the Brazil game. Please donate money each month. It's the way that people will be encouraged to go and see their doctor if they have any symptoms. And, if only Bobby had been diagnosed earlier, he might still be alive now. He was poorly. They didn't get to the bottom of it. And it was Stephanie told me that didn't even change after he'd been referred to a specialist.
It was there that he was misdiagnosed with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, told to man up as it was. And we then moved and inherited a new doctor in Putney. And this doctor, I later learnt, was purely referring to Bobby's notes from the specialist and telling him the same sort of thing. This isn't life-threatening. Go away, adapt to the new lifestyle and live with it. And it took 4 years to get a proper diagnosis, by which time it was too late. He probably would have survived had it been diagnosed right at the outset. If it's diagnosed really early, 9 out of 10 people can be successfully treated.
So there you were, this incredibly fit man, used to run on Putney Heath all the time, was with me travelling around the world, so busy, and he goes to the doctors, and the doctors said, that's it. I think it had spread to the liver by then, hadn't it, Stephanie? Mm. How unimaginable was that to you at that time? How
I don't know. I sort of went into automatic mode then. I don't know how I dealt with it. I wasn't particularly brave. He was exceptionally brave and very, very stoic. Only once did he say to me, and that was about 6 months later, how do you feel about this? And right at the end, when the oncologist who was saying to him, we can't offer you any more chemotherapy, there's nothing left, we can't do anything for you, we walked away. And again, he said, how do you feel about this? And I just said, I think we have to make the best use of the time that we've got.
He didn't go, did he? He's still here because of the work you do. I mean, was that straight away, the Bobby Moore Fund?
It was about 9 months before I spoke to John Mitchell, who was a great, great friend of his, used to play for Fulham, about doing a golf day for the charity. And by that time, I'd approached Cancer Research UK about setting up a charity in Bobby's name. I just knew that this disease was so ignored and so untalked about that people were literally dying from embarrassment. And we had the wherewithal to raise money and to raise awareness, particularly amongst men who don't go to their doctors anyway, about the fact that they have a responsibility to themselves to know about their health and certain signs and symptoms of bowel cancer, amongst other diseases, but particularly bowel cancer. It's our second highest killing cancer in the country. The statistics are appalling. It shouldn't be like that. But Bobby and I discussed this very briefly before he died. And Roy Castle, who was doing his amazing work in the last year of his life, travelling the country as ill as he was, warning people about passive smoking and the dangers of smoking generally. And he wrote to Bobby. He sent Bobby a letter. And Bobby said to me at the time, should we be doing something? And I knew our time together was short, and I knew that Bobby wasn't an entertainer like Roy. I knew the press would be all over us, and I was only just keeping my head above water that last year. I really was. And so I said, later. I'll do something later.
In a way, this is his legacy, isn't it? In a way, that he's helping save lives now.
Well, that is a legacy. I think his legacy was his legacy to football, first and foremost. That was his life, his passion, his first love, and he will always be remembered for that. We've done at Cancer Research UK some market research about Bobby and how young people, whether they know who he is and what he achieved, and we were amazed at the results. People do know what he did. I'm talking about small children here. And so we have been able to go on and build on that. We target particularly men between the ages of about 35 and 60. These are the ones we need to reach. And we've been able to do that through football.
So what would Bobby tell men of that age if they were here now listening to him? Because they'd listen to Bobby.
Well, if you've got rectal bleeding from the bottom, if you were coughing up blood, you'd go to the doctor, wouldn't you? Same thing with bleeding from the bottom, rectal bleeding, or a change in bowel habit, something that's different to you. If that goes on for more than 3 weeks and you've been to see your chemist and it's still going on, go and see your doctor. Both those signs together, or one or the other on their own, go and see your doctor. If your doctor fobs you off and says there's nothing wrong with you and the symptoms continue, go back and ask for a second opinion. I said that to, and he won't mind me telling you because he's spoken about it quite freely, a young man called Andrew Main Wilson, who's the MD of the Institute of Directors. He was in his early 40s at the time. I happened to sit next to him at a dinner and we were talking about it. 8 years later, he phoned me and said, I remembered what you said. And I had those symptoms and I was told there was nothing wrong with me. And I did go back and I did persist and I had bowel cancer. He was a young man with 3 small children. He survived it. It was caught early enough because of his persistence.
Now you need more from general football fans, everyone in the country. How's that going to happen in the next few weeks?
We are launching a nationwide campaign called Make Bobby Proud. And we will be asking people to text to donate £3. We know, as with the Cancer Research UK charity shops, that it's this drip effect. When people pay £1 a month from their wages to Cancer Research UK, that is the bulk of what funds Cancer Research UK's scientific programme. And let us not forget, without the scientific research that's been done on all cancers, we cannot treat people. And I've seen tremendous progress in the world of cancer generally, and particularly bowel cancer, since Bobby died. People can now live with cancer much as they live with any other serious disease like diabetes, for example. That it's honing chemotherapy so that people can take chemotherapy and fight off these tumours as they grow throughout their lives. That's what scientists see for us on the horizon.
Very interesting to hear Stephanie Moore speaking to Jonathan there, and interesting to hear that the power of Bobby Moore's name in getting the message across to cancer, to young men, and the impact it had, Jonathan, with that example that she gave there.
Yeah, and, I go back to the scenes outside Upton Park after he died and the floral tribute there and the way the country reacted at grounds around the nation. It had an effect immediately after Bobby's death, and that effect still lingers because of the Bobby Moore Fund. And please Google it, find the web address, go on and please support Bobby because he was the greatest captain we've ever had.
Jeff, you had a lunch with him just before he passed away at the Royal Garden Hotel in Kensington, where England celebrated winning the World Cup as well. So There was a nice symmetry about that. And that's a lunch I'm sure you cherish and remember very well. Yeah,
he called me up and said he wanted to get together. Obviously, I was aware he was ill, but he hadn't yet announced it. And it was the start of, I referred to in the paper as what Al Pacino called in Centre Woman last tour of the battlefield. This was where they celebrated the World Cup. He went on with Jonathan to broadcast at an England game a few days later, England against San Marino. He wasn't very thrilled with the performance, as I recall. But it was our last chance to do something on our own together, quite obviously. And he didn't eat much and he drank water, which, was unlike him, and I chastised him for that. And then I ribbed him about a red leather coat he'd bought, his last present to himself. And he said, if I've not worn it yet, and if I don't wear it today, and he looked at me and we kind of hugged each other. But we were standing on this flagstone, and they've got a time capsule in the steps of the hotel, and in there is the story, as I put it, of how a young kid from the East End of London came up to collect the most important piece of silverware on the planet from his queen, and her white-gloved hands, as Jonathan described. Him having cleaned his hands on the velvet balustrade. That was an important moment for me, as was when he called me just as he was dying late one evening. He wasn't able to make it on to West Ham, and he explained he was too tired and said good night, and that was the last time I spoke to him. You can get emotional about that, but you can also take comfort from it. When you think about the cancer situation, I mean, people like myself are the same age as Bobby, and we've lived on, and it doesn't seem fair that he didn't. But he never ever said there was anything unfair about it. He never said, why me? He manned up big time, and nothing but admiration for him for that.
And Jonathan, that night against San Marino at Wembley, did you sense that your time together was coming to an end?
Well, the previous Friday, I got a phone call from Nigel Clark of the Mirror, who tipped me off and said the newspapers were going to write a story that Bobby had cancer. And I phoned him up the following day. He was due to go to Chelsea against Villa, and I was due to go to Arsenal against Forest. And that day before, I was in hospital myself, and I had a cancer scare going on. And Bobby encouraged me, never mentioned it on the Friday, but when I spoke to him on the Saturday morning, I said I'd had this call from Nigel, and he said, it's true, and I haven't got long left, Pearce. And I'm asking Jeff to do an interview for all the newspapers around the world, and would you come round on the Monday and do an interview with me after the San Marino game for all the electronic media? We did San Marino. On the Friday, Stephanie spoke to me, and we didn't think it was appropriate for him to go to West Ham because it had become a bit of a circus. So I phoned him up, Mark, and said that I didn't think it was appropriate, really, and I didn't think it would be a kind occasion. And he said, I respect you for your opinion, but you've disappointed me. And they were the last words he ever said to me. And on the Monday, I flew out. On the Wednesday morning, I beg your pardon, the Wednesday night, I flew out. I tried to contact him on the Monday, but he was asleep. And on the Wednesday morning, I flew out to Goa, and I was there, and we were in a hotel. And as soon as I got there, the hotel manager said, you have to phone home, Mr. Pearce, you can't do it, we have no international lines. This was 1993. So I got into a taxi, and for some reason I was a bit distraught, and I said to the taxi driver, I've lost a friend at home, and mentioned Bobby by name. I don't know why I mentioned Bobby by name. And he took me to this little post office in a dusty street in the middle of a jungle across the other side of the world. It had 3 corrugated iron walls, no roof. And I went in there, and it was a wind-up phone, literally a wind-up phone. And I went on and phoned up London, and they said Bobby had died at 6 o'clock that morning, I think it was, Jeff.
6:36.
And I turned around, and as I turned around, the whole street was full. And the taxi driver had told the village the whole street was full. And it was only at that moment that I realised who Bobby Moore was. And it was only then. And again, you know, you can get choked up about it. Or, as Jeff was saying, you can find consolation in that. And I did. And that's really been with me ever since, the reaction of ordinary football fans around the world to this most extraordinary boy from Barking.
Well, here's a text from Arthur Edwards, the well-known photographer from The Sun. When I was young photographer, Bobby Moore never refused a picture, never asked me for a penny. His kindness helped me get to Fleet Street. I absolutely loved him. And Richard Colchester Hammer says, Bobby Moore's my all-time hero. Jeff's piece in the paper today was incredibly moving, had me reading it with tears in my eyes. He's a true legend. It's a travesty that Bobby was never knighted and treated the way he was. But tomorrow night he will be remembered. England v Brazil's one of the games he's always remembered for in the 1970 World Cup, and tomorrow night he'll be remembered as well.
Most people have tears in their eyes when they read my stuff, but for rather different reasons. Let me just one thought here. After we unveiled Bobby's statue, Sir Bobby Charlton unveiled the statue with all the great and the good there, Jack Charlton went back the next morning on his own, and he stood under the statue talking to it. And later he said, well, I went back because I wanted a last chat with Moro. He said, the best man I've ever known. And I think that's what we all feel. So fortunate, people like Jonathan and myself, to have him as a friend, not least because of the realisation that this friend, who thought you were the most important thing in his relationship, was by far the bigger and better character than any of us.
On digital and online.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
bbc.co.uk/5live.